Hello and welcome to our first session, flip session on psychology. And today we are going to do chapter number 4, which is learning. So tell me, what is learning? How will you define learning? Let me give you an example. Suppose you go near a fire and you try to touch a fire. And then later on you realize that the fire is very hot and you move away your hand. What is it? Is it learning? Can we call that as learning? Okay, let me give you another example. Suppose you carry a baby in your arms and then you move a hand over the baby's eyes. Immediately, the baby would blink the eyes. What is it? Is it learning? No, it's not learning. Then what is it? It is a simple reflexes. We all human beings are born with simple reflexes. So that is not part of learning. Then what is learning? Learning is a continuous process. We learn on a daily basis. On every day we learn something new, from simple behavior to complex behavior. What could be the example of simple behavior? Picking up a book could be a simple behavior. Switching off the light could be another example of simple behavior. Drinking a glass of water, another example of simple behavior. And what could be a complex behavior? Which require a lot of effort, okay? So those are called as complex behavior. Like riding a bicycle is a complex behavior. Learning to drive a car is another example of complex behavior. And even your studies could come in complex behavior. So let's move on to the next slide to see what else can we learn. Okay. So in this chapter, we will be learning basic types of learning, two types of learning. One is classical conditioning and the second one is instrument conditioning. And along with these two major learning, we will also learn about skill learning, concept learning, verbal learning, and observational learning. So our first learning is classical conditioning. What is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is also called as learning through association. That means here we learn to associate one thing with another thing. This classical conditioning is also called as Pavlovian conditioning. And it was given by the scientist. This entire experiment of classical conditioning was done by Ivan V. Pavlo. So here, what Ivan V. Pavlo did is he conducted an experiment. And what was the experiment all about? There was a dog, and as we know, the dog would salivate when the food is presented. But he wanted to teach the dog something else also, like how he could associate the food with some other neutral stimulus. So what is the neutral stimulus? So he picked up a bell ring. So whenever the dog was presented with food, before that, he would either whistle or he would either ring a bell, either of the two. And there was a series of trial which he did with the dog. So whenever the dog was presented with the food, just before that, he would ring a bell or he would blow a whistle. And after many trials, the dog learned to associate whistle with the food. Okay. And then after that, slowly, when he learned to associate whistle with the food, after that, what happened is only when the bell was ring, the dog would start salivating, even when the food was not presented. Yes, you are right. Even when the food was not presented, the dog would salivate. And this is how he learned to salivate when only the whistle was blown. So usually this classical conditioning also comes in the paper. They would ask you in the question paper, explain the Pavlo theory, and it usually comes for 4 marks. Here you can also draw a picture of dog explaining the entire experiment. So what is it? This is also there in your textbook. This is before conditioning. Conditioning means learning. Okay. So before learning, the dog would only salivate when the food was presented. And he would not salivate when the whistle is blown or the bell is ring. He would not salivate. But during conditioning means when the dog started learning, what would happen? The dog would salivate when the whistle was blown and the food is presented. So here, during learning, the dog learned to associate food with a whistle. After learning, what happened is, after learning, even when the food was not present, the dog would start salivating. So this is classical conditioning. So you could draw a picture and write it in your own words, what is classical conditioning and what happened in that experiment. And this usually comes for 4 marks. Now, our second learning. What is our second learning? Operant conditioning. Now, what is operant conditioning? It is also called as modification of behavior through reinforcement. Okay, so we modify the behavior through giving reinforcement. Now, what is reinforcement? Reinforcement could be negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. So reinforcement is any action that increases the rate of response. Okay, so whatever action, so when we take an action, it should increase the rate of response. So now we will learn about operant conditioning. This was just an example of reinforcement. So when we take an action and if the action increases in the rate or when the response increases, that is called as reinforcement. I'll give you an example. Okay, if the child is learning, if the child completes the homework, the parent comes and praise the child. What will happen to the child? Will the child increase that behavior? Will the child start doing the homework? Yes. If there is a positive outcome, means the child got that praise, that was a reinforcement. When the child got the praise and the outcome was positive, the child will learn to do that behavior again and again. The child will repeat that behavior. And what is negative reinforcement? When the negative reinforcement is given, what the child will do? I'll give you an example of the negative reinforcement and negative outcome. If the child breaks a plate, okay, and the child gets the scolding from the parents. So what will happen? Will the child repeat that behavior? No, the child will repeat the behavior not to break the plate. Okay, so the child will avoid to repeat that behavior. But in this also he is learning because the outcome was negative. I'll give you an example by this operant conditioning was given by B.F. Skinner. And he did an experiment on this operant conditioning. So what experiment he did is he got a mouse and he caged that mouse in a box. And in that box, there was one lever and there was one space wherein they could provide a food. So this hungry rat is placed in the chamber, in the cage, and because it is a mouse, it started doing random activity. So now the mouse was not instructed anything. And even if we instruct the mouse will not be able to understand. So he started doing the random activity. After some time, the rat accidentally press the lever. And what happened? A food pellet is presented to the mouse, and the mouse became happy. And after some trials, the mouse learned to press the lever. Why? Because the outcome is positive. Positive reinforcement is given and positive outcome, that the mouse was presented with the food. And that is how the mouse learned to press the lever. Very simple. Okay. So this is how the mouse learned to press the lever. This is operant conditioning. And now they tried the opposite thing as well. Now, in the next experiment, what they did is, again, there was a cage and there was a mouse in the cage. But this time, the mouse was given a shock. And there was, again, a lever and there was a lever in the cage. So whenever the mouse would press the lever, the mouse could escape from the shock for 10 seconds. And this is how, after many trials, the mouse learned to press the lever. Okay, so whenever there is a reinforcement which is given, either negative or positive, we learn. So that is the operant conditioning. Now, the other learnings are, the first one is this, these are very simple ones. The first one is observational learning. So this is the third major way we learn. So what is observational learning? It is very simple, as the name suggests. When we observe other and we learn from them, that is called as observational learning, through observation. But what are the few points to remember in observational learning? The first one, it is a part of everyday life. So observation learning is a part, every day we observe something and every day we learn something from others. So that is, it is a part of everyday life. The second is, which is very, very important in observational learning, is we need to have appropriate model. If appropriate, if a right model is not presented, we will learn wrong things. For example, young people learn aggression through watching the action of others. In Tom and Jerry, there are a lot of violence, right? So what happened? The child will learn that violence. So if the right model is not there, we will learn, we will end up learning wrong things. Now, the third point, which is very, very important in observational learning, is we learn various social roles through observational learning. We look around, we see other people, what do they do, and we learn those social roles as well. Like example of social role could be how the way you greet the teachers. Okay, so when the teacher comes in the class, what do you say? Good morning, ma'am, right? Or good afternoon, ma'am. That is a social role. Now, some other types of learning. Now, the next one is, after observational learning, it is verbal learning. So what is verbal learning? People in different parts of the world learn different languages. So verbal learning is used to learn different languages. When you hear people talking, right? And when you learn that language, that is called as verbal learning. The process of learning language is called verbal learning. So when you see people talking, when you listen to that and when you learn it, that is called verbal learning. If you remember your younger days, you will notice that how you have learned a language. First, you will identify the alphabets, then you move on to the words, and then finally to the sentences. And this is how you learn. And this is called as verbal learning. When you listen to someone and you learn, that is called verbal learning. Now, the next one is concept learning. Okay, tell me quickly, which one is living thing and which one is non-living thing? Yes, butterfly is a living thing. Umbrella, it's a non-living thing. Tree is a living thing. Ball is non-living thing. Don't worry, today I'm not going to teach you about living and non-living things. But what is concept learning? This is what we did right now is a concept learning. Okay, concept learning means developing categories of objects and events. When we sort the object and the events in different categories, when we place the object and event in different categories, when we make a table and separate the objects into tables, that is called as concept learning. Another example of the concept learning is concrete and abstract learning. Okay, if I will ask you to I will give you a few words, and when I will ask you to divide into two different table of abstract learning and concrete learning, which could be an abstract learning and which could be a concrete learning, that could be your concept learning. So which are the two things we have to remember in concept learning? First, concept learning help us to reduce the complexity of our world. So it makes our life easy. So the complex things are reduced into simple things. The second thing is all kind of higher learning. Whenever we are doing a higher learning, it involves concept learning. So these are the 2 points which you have to remember in concept learning. Let's move on to the next learning. Transfer of training. So this is the next learning, which is transfer of training. So now what is transfer of training? Transfer of training refers to the process of using earlier learning in a new situation. Let me explain you this by giving an example. Suppose you learn subtraction, addition, multiplication, division in a class. And then you go to the market and you purchase something. And over there, you have applied these concepts. Like when you take some fruit, you have to give the money and then you have to calculate and take the money back. What have you done? You have applied your addition and subtraction in the marketplace. But where have you learned your this concepts? In the classroom. But you have applied this concept in the market. That is called as transfer of training, and you can give this example when you are writing your answers. Now let's do the revision. First, we did classical conditioning. In the classical conditioning, we learned about the experiment of dog and how the dog learns to associate the food with a whistle. Then the next one was operant conditioning. In the operant conditioning, what we learned? We learned the negative outcomes and the positive outcome. Okay, if the positive reinforcement is given, the child will learn to repeat that behavior. And if the negative outcome is there or negative reinforcement is given, the child will learn to avoid those behaviors. Then we learned about concept learning. What was concept learning? When we divide, when we categorize the event and object is called as concept learning. And concept learning is usually, we implement concept learning usually in higher learnings. Then there's a transfer of learning. What was the last transfer of learning? When you apply whatever you have learned in a new situation is called as transfer of learning. Transfer of training. And the last one, observational learning, is when you observe and learn things, that is called as observational learning. Last but not the least, which is verbal learning. What was verbal learning? Verbal learning is usually used to learn languages. When you listen to someone and you learn language, that is called as verbal learning. Last, after this, my session is over. Now I'll give you an assignment, only 2 questions, which you have to write it in your psychology notebook. I'm quite sure that you must have made a separate notebook for psychology. So these are the two questions which usually comes for the exam. This two question I have taken it from 5 years paper. The first one is, what is observational learning with an example? So you have to explain what is observational learning and you have to give one example. And it usually comes for 2 marks. And the next important question is, explain Pavlo theory. Okay, this usually comes for 4 marks. So you can draw a diagram. Okay, sorry, you can draw a picture of dog and whistle and what happens during conditioning, what happens before conditioning. You can make the entire drawing and you can write your answer. So this comes usually for 4 marks. This is where my session ends, and thank you. Hope you enjoyed and learned something from this session.